The great thing about the AI side of things, right, is that you can really elucidate the criteria that you care about.
Welcome to the Tech Savvy Recruiter, the podcast for recruitment and staffing agency owners keen to explore the tech innovations reshaping our industry. I'm Andrew Roger from RecMate.
And I'm Belinda Kerr from Recruitment Garage, and together we're your hosts bringing you a stellar lineup of tech experts ready to help you understand and, more importantly, benefit from the increasing array of tech available to you today. Thank you for joining us today for this episode of the Tech Savvy Recruiter, and Andrew and I are delighted to welcome Pranav Badami. Pranav is the co-founder of Stardex, a flexible ATS and CRM for recruitment firms built with AI workflows from the ground up. And we're delighted to welcome him to today's episode to talk about lots of things, but we're really going to take a deep dive into Boolean Search and what's going on with there and how AI is replacing that, but also what's going on, the truth about AI, hiring, sourcing, etc. So welcome, Pranav. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that before we kick off?
Yeah, no, thanks. That was a great intro, Belinda. Great to be here. And yeah, I mean, excited to talk about Stardex, AI, hiring. Let's jump into it.
Yeah, cool. So I would love to know, because you've come from a dev background, I'd love to know, which is quite different because a lot of the people we have on have often come from the recruitment background and they've kind of decided they're going to solve a problem in recruitment, but you've come from the dev background. So I'd love to know your transition to entrepreneurship. So you co-founded Stardex after working as a full stack developer. What was the motivation to transition to entrepreneurship?
Yeah, that's a great question, Belinda. My co-founder and I, we've known each other since high school and worked together at a startup as well during college. We both took time off. And so we've always been kind of really interested in the space, right? We both love getting our hands dirty, building the actual product, talking to customers. It's just kind of the best part of our jobs and what makes us really excited. And so a few years ago, it was sort of a good time in both of our careers for both of us to take the leap and work on our own company. And that's where we ended up building a previous product called Dots, which was really a community engagement tool. And we ended up going through Y Combinator, which is a big accelerator here in the Bay Area for startups, and built that product out. And as we were doing a lot of the sales process for Dots, what ended up happening, we had to do a ton of manual research on companies, on people. And over time, we realized that, okay, with Dots, the market wasn't sort of materializing as consistently and large as we initially thought. And so when a lot of the AI tooling came out, we were like, oh, this is a really cool way to automate a lot of this research work, right? And that's really where we first built out the initial version of Stardex. And that got picked up by recruiters. And yeah, happy to talk through what that bit of the journey was like. But it's been a little bit of a winding road, but really we're both, builders at heart, great time in our careers to sort of work together. And then, yeah, interesting path to recruiting for sure.
Great. So what was it that the recruiters picked up on?
Yeah, so we had built, after, we had kind of built Dots, it was running. And then what we realized was, okay, with these AI tools, we should be able to automate a lot of this browser research, right? So say, for example, I have a list of 500 Series A and Series B startups, right? With Dots, we were looking for companies that had communities. So we'd click on their website, see if they had a community link, click on that, store which platform the community was on, and so on and so forth. And so we built this AI browser automation prototype where you could give it instructions, right? So you could say for everyone in this list, click on them, check if they have XYZ criteria, output their email, so on and so forth. And we launched that thinking it was more of a salesy tool for, sales operations and stuff like that, but really ended up getting more traction with recruiters that were working at search firms and agencies and that were using it for outbound sourcing and identifying new candidates. And that's where we really started focusing in on more because we had a lot more traction and we realized just how manual the process was. And also that, and we could touch on this later, also that, it's not as AI sourcing is not as easy as just throwing someone's LinkedIn profile into ChatGPT, as you both know. And so really started to fall in love with the problem. And this was about a year ago. And we kind of essentially built a research agency that was trying to automate the sourcing aspect, right? And provide good lists. And then through that process, realized, wow, okay, a lot of this data is just going into pretty old school ATSs, candidate databases that let the data get out of date. Don't actually let you search it effectively. Don't let you action on it very effectively. And definitely don't integrate any of the AI tooling into the process. So yeah, that's how we kind of got into recruiting, and then realized, wow, there's like quite a exciting opportunity here to build a much better autonomous system for search firms and agencies.
Very cool. Well, congratulations on what you've done so far. It's great.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Appreciate
certainly.
that.
I often use the analogy with clients. Some ATSs, the way that they're trying to integrate AI at the moment is like putting lipstick on a pig.
Exactly. Yep.
If you don't have the right base level, you can put certain elements, right? Let's face it. You can put some limited stuff, but it doesn't just work with the whole from, acquisition right through to any sort of post-placement care work that you might want to do, plus everything in between to keep you, the recruiter, on track to do what you need to do today, this week, this month, etc. I think it'll get to a stage where there will be limitations of perhaps some of the market leaders in the space today, where they're busily trying to play a bit of catch up, whereas you guys have got a fresh deck to deal with, which is really exciting. I was reading on your website in the blog section. It's a really interesting read. So anybody who's listening, definitely have a look at stardex.ai or .com. They've got the .com now as well.
Yes.
And their blog section was quite interesting. One of the most recent articles there is how to use Boolean Search on LinkedIn Recruiter and why it's going extinct soon, which I guess leads to a topic that BK and I were thinking about the other day when we were working out what we were going to quiz you on, is around Boolean Search. And the perspective, or your perspective, let's put it this way, is that it is becoming obsolete with AI candidate search in the mix. And obviously your platform does that natively. Can you, I guess, tell us a little bit more about your perspective here and why you reckon it is becoming obsolete?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it makes total sense why Boolean search became such a big thing, right? Like, essentially all of the sort of SaaS products or on-prem products of the past 20 years were basically just static databases, and you needed a little bit more flexibility in the filtering, right? So, okay, there's a bunch of text. How can we sort of combine filters, exclude things, all of that? It makes total sense. But, at the end of the day, it's always been quite brittle. So it's very non-resilient to just small changes in the words that you're putting in, like spelling errors, synonyms, etc. The second piece, it's really very keyword focused. So it's not conceptual at all, right? So if you're essentially looking for, let's say, you're looking for a Python developer, and then you have a bunch of frameworks in Python, like there's a big one called Django, for example. That's not going to get pulled up in your Boolean unless you literally put in like the 100 other Python frameworks that are relevant. And lastly is it just is not contextual enough for most people's needs, right? So things like, how long have you spent in a given role? How long have you spent in a functional area? It's really missing a lot of those things, and it's just very surface level. And so with the AI aspect of it, I'd love to kind of talk through how we see that evolving. But I think that's where a lot of the issues are with Boolean search. And then I think now with AI, it's just generally much more about conceptual understanding that these models have. And then, of course, we can talk through like where, are some of the pitfalls in that. But it can go a lot more. It can do a lot more than the Boolean search could in the past.
Let's explore that a little bit further, because I think a lot of people would like to hear that around the concept that you guys have around AI search versus Boolean search, and maybe you can give us a little bit of a deep dive into how that works within your system and why it's conceptually better than the traditional Boolean mechanism. And those that are using Boolean search today works very well for those that can master Boolean, but certainly in my travels and when we engage with customers, it's not a natural language for most recruiters, right? So it's something that they have to think about, and it's even for people that use it a lot, it's still not natural. It's not a fluent language for most, whereas, well, I'll let you speak around the AI side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the great thing about the AI side of things, right, is that you can really elucidate the criteria that you care about, right? So for example, if you want like this Python developer that has, X years of experience as a software engineer or certain types of career progression, you can basically put all those in as different criteria, right? And then the way that AI search works, like in Stardex and some other platforms, for example, is number one, you mentioned, you touched on this earlier, Andrew, you can use the AI to essentially set up your course like filters, right? So things like location, basic job titles, all of that, it can set those up for you, right? And then once you go a level deeper, essentially what you want to use the AI for is to shortlist like a list of maybe 200 candidates that have similar characteristics to what's in the query. And then you can actually have essentially Chat GPT, or that's how you can think about it, right? It can actually go review each of those criteria, right? So, okay, software engineer with 5 years of experience with Python, right? So it can actually go evaluate that. Whereas if I am a software engineer and maybe I used Python like for a job, 2 years ago, and I was at that job for 2 years, for example, I wouldn't meet that criteria, right? And it can actually automatically like reason on that. And it'll also be more resilient to these like conceptual things, right? So if you say, whatever JavaScript developer, it'll know all those things that are in that ecosystem so that it knows that, okay, this person used XYZ tool that's related to JavaScript. Okay, that should count as part of my criteria, right? And then the other piece, it's also much more resilient to things like typos, misspellings, and just slight variations on words and things like that, where Boolean's actually quite brittle as well. So the way that we generally, to sum it up, the way that we see it, you can use the AI search to build your course filters, essentially shortlist people. And we can talk about how the shortlisting happens as well. There's a interesting sort of technical side tangent there. And then you can have AI actually review the profiles. Right? And we can talk about techniques on how to make the profiles like have more context so that they can find more relevant results. But that's generally how the process works with an AI search tool.
Yeah, I think that shortlisting piece is really interesting for a lot of recruiters because sometimes you get an influx of applicants coming in your front door or in your inbox, and you might have sometimes 300 to 400 applicants for a particular role, and the 232nd one could be the perfect person for this job, right?
Absolutely.
And if I'm working sequentially, or maybe they applied 2 days after the main influx came through, and I've got my long list, I've developed that into a short list, I'm talking to the client already, and then this person applies. Sometimes they just get buried in the noise. And that's where I see the beauty of AI stepping in and giving us a hand to say, hey, have a look at this profile. It's the perfect match. Maybe supplement the shortlist you've already submitted to the client with this candidate. We just can't do that as humans, or Boolean certainly can't do that in terms of flagging things as they come through the front door that they should be, getting the recruiter's attention.
Yeah,
just
for sure.
A quick question I've got for you. So I know like with Boolean, like for example, with X-ray Boolean searching, it's getting harder and harder because sites are blocking out X-ray. So when it comes to AI, what's the difference there? Like how does it get through that lock, if you like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we have it like we are focused very much on your internal candidate database, right? So for example, like if you have data that's locked up in an old system, for example, we'll migrate that over, put that onto Stardex and enable the search on top of that. And then as you're sourcing, let's say on LinkedIn, or you're getting resumes in, you can basically very easily add those profiles into Stardex with sort of one click, right? I think for other tools, this is where it gets definitely a little tricky with some of the tools that are focused on AI search on external candidate data, right? A lot of this stuff is kind of folks will buy like, public data sets of LinkedIn data and essentially apply this process that we were just talking about on that data set, right? And I think that's where it is definitely a little tricky. And it's very, right now, the ecosystem of external sourcing tools is kind of very dependent on this underlying market of data providers that are selling LinkedIn data. But that's where we are quite different. Our kind of hypothesis here is that as your firm continues to gather data on your candidates, right, through interviews, right, also through the sourcing process, through notes, whatever the case is, all of that can get bubbled up into the search. And so that's why we actually think it's much more powerful to look at sort of the internal data set. Of course, there is definitely a place for the external sourcing, 100%. But kind of our focus has been not to look at that as much because we see that as a little bit more of a, it's almost like building on a house of cards where like could get taken away, like you're saying, Belinda, if, some companies like crack down on it and so on. So yeah, there's definitely a risk for the external sourcing side of things.
So the logic there would be, so then if you've got agencies that try and keep their data to a minimum to keep it clean per se, then the logic here would say we're actually better off loading more in so that we've got a bigger pool to go from, which kind of flies in the face of adversity from traditional thinking to a degree. Yeah, yep. Interesting. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, if you've got the tool set to do the digging for you,
exactly.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
You've got like a sniper who knows exactly what they're looking for, and she's a marksman that like no other and can hit that target really well. And it doesn't matter with the clutter that's there. So
yeah, exactly.
I think a goal for a lot of agencies, right, BK, that you probably speak to around use what you have already and then go supplement that with something else, because even for a small agency, they develop quite a large database quite quickly, tens of thousands of applicants in there from previous roles. And it's really difficult to keep that fresh and current and all that kind of good stuff without some tools to help you hone into the right segments of that database.
So is the AI then just looking at the resume, or this might be a bit of a blonde question, or is it looking outwardly, like it's sort of going, oh, that's the person, now we'll look outwardly to kind of ratify what the resume says? What are they actually looking at?
That's a great point. So, there's a couple things, right? So there's, of course, like the resume or the LinkedIn profile information that the person has put in. That's one part. The other part is, again, like I mentioned, if you do an interview with the candidate, right? Either the notes or even the raw transcript from that could potentially be an input into the system. And then the third part that I think most folks don't sort of immediately realize is the company contextual information. Mm-hmm. So let's say I worked at, Ramp, for example, right? Ramp is like, I don't know, like Series D or Series E or something at this point. I'm not exactly.
Interestingly, I was listening to a podcast provider and they apparently only take in something like 0.02 applicants. Percentage of applicants.
Oh, wow.
So they're very, 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 very particular about who they hire. And
I could imagine that they could be quite selective. But essentially what you can do there is you can actually feed in context about the companies that the person has worked at, right? So rather than just saying, like, if you think about, Belinda, like if you just feed in just a raw resume, right? Like to ChatGPT or something and it said Ramp, and let's say that's a new company, or Cursor, for example, is like a new company that's been blowing up, if y'all have heard of that. The models may not even know about those companies, for example, right? And so what we do is essentially also enrich the data about the company, right? So things like, obviously, the description, the location, the funding round, the size of the company, potentially like revenue and things like that. If you have a Crunchbase account, those are all things that can be fed in to the context, in addition to the resume and all the like transcripts and notes that you have on the candidate, right? So all of that can be fed in and be part of the AI search as in addition to the resume.
I was just thinking about that with, for example, the company information. Does that data set, is that brought into the core database, or is that they see Ramp in there and then it knows to go out and search for that company Ramp and does a profile check on Ramp, but it doesn't bring Ramp's profile back into the data set? How does that work?
That's a great question. Yeah. So in our case, we do bring that into the data set. So into your database. So basically, like when you click on Ramp in Stardex, you'll see all the candidates that you've, that currently work there or have previously worked there. And then you'll also see some of that identifying information about the company, just like the summary. And obviously for some big companies, it's not that relevant, but for a lot of the like startups or even SMBs that folks might have worked at, it is actually quite relevant. So
that's usually fairly niche, aren't they? Some of those startups and
exactly.
So Pranav, what's really interesting is that often recruitment will lean on SaaS or, software outside of recruitment and pull those in. I'd love to know, because that's kind of traditionally your background as well, coming from outside recruitment in, and I'd love to know what your thoughts are around that and the bigger, broader world has to offer recruitment that maybe we're not even seeing yet.
Yeah, that's a great question, Belinda. And yeah, there's obviously a ton going on with AI being used in like every sort of vertical out there, right? Like I'll give y'all an example. Like I'd met a friend of mine who had also gone through the Y Combinator accelerator a few years back, and they're building like a property management system for landlords. And they have a bunch of invoices coming in, and they're using AI to like parse those invoices and show you a little scorecard where you can either like, accept or decline whether that invoice should be processed, right? So that's like one example where we were actually able to like apply that to recruiting. And I'll kind of like walk through the example here, but it's been really interesting to see the cross-pollination of the things going on. So like in this case, we had a firm that we were talking to where they have a pretty large taxonomy, right, of preferences that their candidates have on things like geography, industry, so on and so forth. And currently, the recruiters are manually updating those preferences after every call. And there's like 30 of them, right? Because there's like 10 industries, there's like 20 geographies, and each time it's like after a call, I have to like summarize it, and then I have to update those fields in my database, right? And we were able to kind of take this idea that one of my other startup friends had in a different vertical and apply it here, where once you have the interview completed, we can actually show you that scorecard, right? So we can say, Belinda's now open to Sydney, or, not open to Adelaide, or whatever the case might be. And it'll automatically suggest the taxonomy updates for you, and you just hit approve, right? And then it'll just go make those updates for you. So that's where I think it's like really interesting for us to basically bring in our perspective from outside of recruitment and seeing where all these like startups are innovating, and then bring it into the actual recruitment and search firm and agency workflows.
Interesting.
Love that concept of fresh blood into the industry, because it is, I guess, often governed by salespeople who turn into managers, who then have a great idea, and then they develop an idea, but they've just lived and breathed recruitment. Whereas the beauty of having that external lens, look at how we do things as recruiters, is such a wonderful thing, I think, for the industry. I was listening to a Startup Ideas podcast by Greg Eisenberg. I'm not sure if you've
right. Yep.
heard of
I've
that.
come across it. Yes.
Yeah. And his philosophy is, if you see an export button, it's an opportunity for AI to take over. Okay. So if you see a manual click to download something, it's a chance for an AI app to enhance customer or user experience.
Exactly.
So where there's a manual, put a skill in, that kind of stuff, there's an opportunity for AI to enhance user experience. So old, let's call them pre-2015 or pre-2020 developed systems, let's call it that way, I think are going to play big catch-up games in the next couple of years to remain relevant. So be interesting to see how they cope with those type of things there, because it's always going to be a snap-on top of their infrastructure as it is. But I just love that fresh approach to what we're doing, and to help us do things smarter, quicker, and ultimately, hopefully, giving better customer experience for our customers, be it the candidate or the client as well. Right? I was chatting with another mate who's also a entrepreneur and developer of a software system for recruiters, and they're just starting to embed some AI into their functionality. And I think some people underrate the amount of work that is behind the scenes of that button that you might click for an AI thing to kick off, an AI sequence. He was saying that one of his AI prompts is 720 words long. And it spits out 4 or 5 bullet points. As a summary for a report. Okay. Yep. So whereas, I don't know, most people listening to this podcast or viewing it would be rookie on the ChatGPT front in terms of prompting language and prompting capabilities. So nevertheless, we're experimenting with tools like ChatGPT all the time. And, you mentioned doing that experimentation with ChatGPT tools and rapidly building app prototypes might be, a really interesting way to move forward with, I guess, doing things in a better way. So with that in mind, how's integrating AI tools like the good old ChatGPT influence your development workflows and the features that you've got in your platform?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. We lean pretty heavily on AI tools in the development of Stardex, right? And obviously, building a sort of base ATS CRM layer, wanting it to be really flexible, wanting it to have good user experience, wanting it to use all these AI things itself. There's quite a lot of surface area to cover, right? And in the past, I think we would have moved a lot slower because each of those features would have taken us sort of a few weeks to build out, whereas now we can build it out in a couple of days. And I think that's where, so we use tools like Cursor, for example. If the audience isn't super familiar with this, it's sort of, you can think about it as a code editor, right? And then it has essentially ChatGPT on the side, and then it integrates whatever ChatGPT generates back into the code. And so it just like really quickly like takes it from here, puts it in here, and then you can sort of test how it works in your application, for example. So that's been really helpful for us. And a lot of that is what, it's also inspiring how we kind of think about the product, right, in Stardex. And one of the examples is, for example, like candidate summaries. So let's say you go to a jobs page in Stardex. You can essentially look at, okay, there's these 6 candidates that we've interviewed. 3 of them are at the final interview stage. Okay, great. I just want to select them all and generate a quick summary, right, that I can share with my client. And that'll basically look again at like all your notes and all of that. And that was directly inspired by how some of these AI tools in our own process work. And yeah, so it's been really interesting it's similar to the cross-pollination idea that we just talked about before, where one of those big areas where we draw inspiration from is also like the development process. And so it has been cool to think about, okay, how can we apply that to Stardex as well? And it's been really great to also dog food the product ourselves, because we use it for our own business development. And
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, we use it all day. So it's great. Yeah, it's really fun.
I was speaking to a Salesforce development company the other week, and he said, Andrew, it's a little bit embarrassing, but we haven't yet moved across to Salesforce. We use a different product to manage our customer prospecting, but I am building it out right now. So, because we want to, eat your own dog food or sip your own champagne, whatever you want to use as a phrase.
I prefer champagne.
Yeah, BK's on the champagne.
That's a much more fun way to put it, actually, than the dog food version.
Yeah,
I've never heard that.
Yeah, I've always sort of cringed a little bit when I've said that. So I was trying to think of something else. Yeah, if you're starting to, because you'll see some of the things that your customers are stating when you start utilizing your own product and your own workflows and things like that, and come up with some really, really great ideas. But getting back to what you're saying about the speed at which you can develop stuff today, it's just phenomenal. I was watching something the other day, and they were playing with the ChatGPT operator, and they were making a mock of DocuSign, okay, for the e-signature elements of DocuSign. It got pretty much there on that development within 45-minute YouTube clip I was watching. It wouldn't have been ready to go to market at that stage, but within an hour it had a very good base from which you can do much quicker development to get to a prototype, to get some client feedback.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's going to lead to things being superseded so quickly. We're going to see an increasing rate of, that tech was great 6 months ago when it was launched, but already it's now old news, which adds a whole set of challenges, doesn't it? Which actually leads me, Pranav, to, I'd love to know, particularly with your background and the exposure that you've had to recruitment so far, what do you see in terms of tech, AI, kind of using your experience and your knowledge? Where do you see recruitment heading with all of this in the next, I don't know, 12 months is a short time now, but, the short term, 12 months, 2 years, etc.?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think definitely what I'm seeing is there'll be like a lot of the sort of grunt work that was involved, right? The manual work. I think the systems will kind of evolve to take that off of the recruiter's plate. And then people will actually be able to focus on the areas where they have a unique value, right? Where essentially in the interviewing process, and I would love to talk through that whole thing. It's been a lot of AI interviewing hype, honestly, out there that I think is quite misguided in some ways. And I think people will be able to focus more on that part of it, right? Getting to know the candidates better, getting to actually understand the hiring manager and their needs, the client's needs better, right? That's like 90% of the time, it's like the challenge is just being on the same page with what the hiring manager wants, making sure you understand that exact persona, and then actually evaluating whether the candidate is that exact persona, and then selling the hiring manager on the candidate as well, right? So those are the actual bits that I think folks actually want to, that's where they want to spend their time. And I think they will be able to do that because a lot of these things like updating your database, like doing a lot of the like manual sourcing, copying data from one place to another, those things will kind of be eliminated, which I think is overall really good for productivity. And then people will actually be able to focus on, okay, I have a deep well of expertise interviewing sales executives. Where do I need to dig deeper? What do I need to understand about the hiring manager's needs, right? And focus on those areas and actually spend more time there as opposed to the sort of grunt work aspect. And that's certainly where we're that's the direction that we're skating in with Stardex.
Can we dig into the interview hype? I want to hear your perspective around AI interview hype, because it is featured in a lot of platforms or being marketed by a lot of software development companies as a product.
It's pretty interesting. Yeah, it's certainly an interesting space. And I think in certain roles, it, can serve a useful function. And it almost helps to get like a quick snippet of what this person is like, maybe before you decide to proceed with interviewing them or booking a call with them. I think for those use cases, it does have value. I think where a lot of folks, they see the demos, they see the AI having a conversation and they're like, whoa, like this whole process can be eliminated. And I don't think that's quite true, because if you ever ask ChatGPT something in detail about something really well, and it says something, and then you say, no, that's not true, it'll just agree with you. Yeah, you're right. That's not true. Sorry. Like, like you're absolutely right. And that's where interviewing is actually, that's where the skill of interviewing is, right? It's like knowing when to say, oh, like that's an interesting story. Let me dig deeper on that. Or wait, that doesn't sound quite right based on all the things I've heard about or what the hiring manager has told me and my experience. Let me like dig deeper there and understand what this person's like actual kind of experience is like, right? It's the type of thing where on the surface level, it looks like it's sort of doing 80% of the work, but the real like separation in determining whether this person's a great fit or not is in that last 20%, right? And that's actually where the models, they're not necessarily like, you could prompt them to be a little bit more assertive and things like that. But of course, like a person's going to be much more precise and sort of incisive with the questions that they have and really get to know the person much more deeply. So I think that's where a lot of the value is in those conversations. And then also like in bringing those conversations back up in the future, right? If you're a couple years down the line and you want to reconnect with a candidate or for another role potentially down the road, or they're back on the market, you can sort of lean on those conversations and actually reference them again. So that's where I think it's like, it's getting a little frothy with the hype on it. Certainly has a place, but I think people can go sort of, going from that 80% to the 99%, that's where a lot of the skill part is.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think with maybe high volume recruitment, it's probably an ideal tool to get that pre-screen questionnaire out of the way and maybe do a little bit of screening at that point and then pass it off to the human to do the last, 5-10%, whatever it might be at that stage. I think you might have mentioned, we're a little way off getting that full analysis on tone and speed of pitch and all that kind of stuff, which will change if I'm maybe telling something that's untrue. We will get there, and I'm sure that there's prototypes out there that will have a red light flashing on the screen now if BK is telling a little bit of a porky pie in the conversation. So then I can probe into that part of the discussion that I'm having just to see what's do a bit of digging in that area there.
Yeah, for sure. I think as a sidekick, I think there's some room for that for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I like your perspective around having that all indexed and referenceable for the future as well, because I think that's something that, I know recruiters hate any sort of admin. And so if we hop off a phone call, that's all done for me. And it's there, it's in a perfect format for my colleagues or for me to look at in the future at some point. And it's indexed as well for searchability for upcoming searches that'll highlight this candidate again. We talked a little bit about this in the question around the the interviewing. Are there any other misconceptions that you're hearing in the market and happy to raise where AI isn't the bee's knees for the recruitment market? Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think, and we kind of wrote another blog post about this piece as well, where it's kind of what I mentioned earlier around AI sourcing not being just as easy as throwing resumes and LinkedIn profiles into ChatGPT. And there's really there's really three major reasons why, we actually tried to do stuff similar to this, right? I mentioned at the top of the show, sort of the research agency that we ran for a while last year. And we learned a lot through that. And the main thing is that there's a big sort of contextual gap is the first thing, right? So a lot of our customers, they would say, I want someone who's worked at a startup, Okay, well, there's lots of companies that Ramp, if someone worked at Ramp a year ago, you could say that's a startup, but maybe what I actually mean is a Series A, Series B startup, right? So how do you dig deeper on that bit of context? And then the other piece is also, as I mentioned, that the models don't have all the information that they need. So there's a lot of proprietary information about companies, about people that is not in the training data, essentially, of these models. And so you actually need to give it data on what these companies do. That's another piece. And then the last piece is really around relevancy. Relevancy is if I have 5 criteria, one is an absolute must-have deal breaker. And then one of the criteria is they definitely cannot have this criteria. It's actually the models, they're very people pleasy, right?
Yeah.
In the sense that they're very trained to be very helpful assistants. And that's great, but they also don't necessarily weigh those elements that we might know it. This thing is way more important than the other thing. Hey, it's okay. We can disqualify this person for this reason because they don't meet this criteria, right? That's also a big area where there's a gap in what people think that, I can just kind of throw this in and then they're kind of bummed out by the results because it's not going to just work like that out of the box. There's, as you mentioned earlier, Andrew, with like the big prompt that your friend or colleague was mentioning, there's a lot of additional things you need to provide so that it has at least some of the context that you have as a recruiter. And there's quite a bit of work in bridging that gap. So that's like another big thing I've seen in the market of AI sourcing and AI interviewing are, I guess, the two most buzzy kind of spaces right now, and some of the pitfalls of those.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity, I think, behind those both, aren't there? And, the other elements along our workflow as well as recruiters too. So, yeah, smart to partner where you can with companies that are trying to navigate that rocky road. So, we can do the human stuff.
Absolutely.
And on that note, Pranav, thank you so much. I really love the way that you've come from outside the industry and really, pinpointed some key challenges and started to really get your handle around what it needs and bringing that fresh insight. It's been really interesting speaking with you and hearing your perspective on things. And so with that said, I'd love to hear a little bit more about Stardex and how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, no, appreciate you both having me on. It's been really great. Stardex is the autonomous ATS and CRM for search firms and agencies. And we have a very simple, customizable ATS and CRM. And then we use AI workflows on top of that, right, to help you land and execute searches faster. So for example, and we haven't touched much on the BD side of things, but one example of an AI workflow is, we're helping a customer automatically identify 3 great fits from their database whenever they're on a jobs page. So they can automatically and immediately add value when reaching out to a prospective client, for example. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. But our vision is to have Stardex actually do a lot of the sourcing, organization, and engagement work for you, the recruiter, so that you can actually move faster and focus on the areas where you bring a unique perspective. And so we've been working with a bunch of search firms, and you can find out more about us on stardex.com. And we'd love to chat and kind of hear about your firm and see where we could help out.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And we, maybe a little bit down the track when who knows where this journey will take you, maybe in a year or so we have you back on and hear, what's happened in the meantime.
Yes, I'm excited. I mean, this was a great conversation. So I'd love to be back at any point if y'all will have me.
Of course we would. All right. Well, all the best with it. And there's a ton of value there for our listeners. So thank you very much for your time. And of course, we wish you all the very best. Thanks for joining us for today's episode of the Tech Savvy Recruiter. If you'd like to stay up to date with the latest recruitment trends and insights, make sure that you remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And also, if you'd like to speak to Andrew about turning your tech stack into your secret weapon, or myself around creating an agency that delivers you more money, more meaning, and more freedom, we'd absolutely love to chat. Reach out to us on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for your support. We look forward to seeing you next time.